Hi, everyone, and welcome to Katie Couric. In 1985, National Geographic published an image of an Afghan girl with haunting and brilliant eyes who captivated the world. At that time, her nation was at war with the Soviet Union. 25 years later, Time magazine's cover portrays the disturbing image of another Afghan girl, Aisha. Her nose and ears were cut off by the Taliban because she tried to flee her abusive husband and in-laws. On the cover, the words, "What happens if we leave Afghanistan?" My guests are Rick Stengel, managing editor of Time, and Zama Coursen-Neff, deputy director of the Children's Rights Division at Human Rights Watch. And as always, before our conversation, I'd like to quickly thank the sponsor of our web show, Dove. Thank you both so much for coming in. I really, really appreciate it. Rick, I know that you went through a lot thinking about this cover, and you didn't do it without a great deal of thought. Mm-hmm. Tell me some of the things you were wrestling with when it came to deciding whether or not you would put Aisha on the cover of Time magazine.
Well, as you said, Katie, it's hard to look at. It's a very graphic image. It's very powerful. It's very disturbing. And I thought about it from all different kinds of perspectives. Obviously, one about her own safety, which is something we looked into, and we're helping her get out of Afghanistan and get surgery. I thought about it from the perspective of how would children react to it, and we talked to child psychologists about it, and not that allayed all of my fears, but it was interesting what they had to say.
So, well, tell me, but before you go on, what did the child psychologists say?
You know, they said that younger kids in particular would find it disturbing because they would just interpret it as bad things can happen in the world and they can happen to me. You know, the older you get, when I showed it to, I have two sons, my older boy asked me, well, what happened to her? Why did they do that? Who did it? I mean, that kind of cause and effect is something that, you know, we as adults do and only older children do. So for younger children, it's a very scary image. And finally, of course, you know, the issue for me was this is such an important debate going on. What we do in Afghanistan, how long do we stay? What is our mission there? What is the nature of our commitment to the Afghanistan people? That I just felt that I really wanted us to weigh in a powerful way with one particular point of view. I mean, there have been so many different points of view, and we had a fantastic story by our Afghanistan-Pakistan bureau chief, Aaron Baker, about the role of women in Afghan society and how that had changed since 2001 and since the U.S. invasion and the evolution of women in Afghan society. And to me, when the American public, when the administration, when President Obama is thinking about making these decisions, this is a factor, an important factor that should weigh in. And for all of those reasons, I felt that it was important to publish this image.
You've gotten some blowback as a result of this, haven't you? As if it's interesting. There's no question mark. What happens if we leave Afghanistan? Was that intentional?
Well, I never. I mean, you know, I think we answer questions. I don't think we ask them. And you know, to me, this is a story about, again, you know, is this what is going to happen to every woman in Afghanistan, you know, if the U.S. leaves? But the story has a strong point of view saying, in fact, the role of women has been enhanced. It has been modernized. Girls are going to school. Women are in parliament. Women are on television. Their lives have changed in different parts of Afghanistan. And so I wanted people to be confronted with the idea that there are consequences of us leaving, consequences on humanitarian grounds, consequences that people will understand and relate to, particularly women can relate to. So I wanted this to be a factor in the conversation going forward. You can make the decision and say, you know what, we can leave and women will be damaged, but I wanted people to be cognizant of that.
Zama, do you feel as if this aspect of the story since the invasion in 2001 has been ignored or at least neglected in some way by the media?
Well, Human Rights Watch has been documenting human rights violations against women and girls in Afghanistan for a long time, but including after the Taliban was ousted in 2001. And what we've said is so important now is that with any kind of negotiation, any kind of reintegration, reconciliation with the Taliban, women's rights have to be at the forefront of that. They are not some sort of luxury or some sort of side part of a peace deal. They have to be at the core of any kind of peace settlement. I mean, women are in a much better position than they were 10 years ago.
Before we talk about, Zama, sort of how to move forward and the questions about reconciliation with the Taliban, which is something that has been in the ether for a while now, tell us how life has changed for women in Afghanistan. Give us just sort of a snapshot, if you will, since 2001, the strides that they've made and the strides they haven't.
Well, life for women in Afghanistan is much better than it was 10 years ago under the Taliban. Women and girls are going to school. There are more girls in school than there ever have been before in Afghanistan. On the other hand, something like 1,000 schools have been rocketed or burned, hundreds of teachers and students have been killed, and still more than half of all primary school-age girls are not in school.
Is that because they're too afraid? I was going to ask you about the female population in Afghanistan. Are many of them, do they feel that change is almost more frightening than the status quo for them? And so is progress being held back by Afghan women themselves in some ways? And you can understand it, by the way. I'm not being critical.
Well, there's no question that women in Afghanistan live under threat of violence all of the time, and people who commit gross acts of violence against women almost are never punished. So that threat is always there. That means if you as a parent are deciding, do I send my daughter to school, you have to consider, is she going to be kidnapped on the way?
Is she going to be killed as a result? Is acid going to be thrown in her face?
Exactly. Is a bomb going to be left under her teacher's chair, like a school that I visited in rural Afghanistan? You have to deal with the threat of violence and, most importantly, impunity for violence all the time.
If I were a mom, I might choose to not send my daughter to school if I thought if she were risking her life in the process.
But so many mothers have told me in Afghanistan that they want education for their children, and they are really putting their lives, in some cases, on the line to fight for that. And those are the women who need our support.
I know that you talked to our producer, Tony Masilis, about this, about ways to advance the cause for girls and women, and they're sort of smart, savvy ways that will, not sort of raise the ire of the Taliban. It's sort of doing it in a much more subtle, sort of low-key, undercover way. Is that how girls are having to be educated?
Well, whatever happens, women and girls need to be at the table, and not just in an undercover way. I mean, women and girls have a long history of trying to provide more subtle community-based education, for example. But in any kind of decisions about Afghanistan's future, Human Rights Watch has said that women need to be at the table, and they need to be at the table in a real way, not in just a token way. So that means having a say in what the principles are of who is going to be let back into government, but also in who the individuals are that they might be considering reconciling with.
In this article, Rick, there's a lot of talk at the beginning of the piece about the notion of reconciliation with the Taliban, that, what I think Hamid Karzai called them something, our troubled brothers,
right.
or something like that. And there's a real fear that basically women are going to be sacrificed, and the strides that they've made are going to be sacrificed because of this timetable President Obama has set for July of 2011, and the fact that there's a clamoring here at home by many to get the troops out of Afghanistan. So that's put women in a tough position, hasn't it, in Afghanistan? And many of them are very, very afraid.
Sure. And look, the realism of the situation is that when the U.S. talks about extricating itself from Afghanistan, and Hamid Karzai reads polls here too, he starts to think, how do I preserve myself in office? How do I preserve my government? Do I need to actually talk to the enemy and form some kind of rapprochement with them to move forward? Because my ally, the U.S. and the coalition, are going to be gone. So, I mean, it seems to me natural that he would do that, and that has been part of the equation that people have been talking about now for at least a year. At the same time, I mean, if that is a relationship of convenience, if it's something to preserve his power rather than preserving democracy or certain of the values that we would have liked to have inculcated in a modern Afghanistan, then of course women are greatly at risk. I mean, the people who know a lot more about this than I do say that the Taliban that Karzai is talking to are not the people, not the ideologue extreme versions of the Taliban, but the people who are actually more soldiers of convenience who operate on both sides.
For economic reasons.
For economic
they're
reasons.
even called something, sort of like mini Talibs or something, or right?
$10 Talib.
What are they called?
The $10 Talib.
$10 Talibs, that's right.
But I think that's a very dangerous picture to put forward without
And a lot of people
recognizing.
think it's a slippery slope, right?
I mean, this is a group with a very, very abusive ideology, and we're not just talking about. A conservative culture. We're talking about putting people in power who have blood on their hands, and that's something that should be unacceptable both to the United States and to the Afghan government.
If we do leave, I mean, obviously our influence diminishes by a great deal. I mean, again, I put Aisha's picture on the cover of Time, but the notion that we will, in a few years, be able to radically change cultural norms in that society is a little bit unrealistic.
But I don't think we're talking about radically changing cultural norms. I mean, I don't think you can find a culture anywhere in the world who thinks it's acceptable for schoolgirls to have acid thrown on their faces. I mean, I think what we're talking about is having a government that preserves the most fundamental aspects of women's rights. That's to work, to get an education, and to participate in the political life of the country. This isn't some sort of Western imposition of women's rights. These are the most basic. I mean, it can come down to basically freedom from violence. And that's something that Afghan women themselves are demanding.
Is Hamid Karzai, in your view, Zama, the right partner to move women's rights forward and to basically preserve them even without a U.S. presence?
Well, we're very concerned that Hamid Karzai doesn't have a strong track record on women's rights. I mean, he has a history of trading off women's rights when it was politically expedient, whether it's signing off on a Shia personal law that denied women custody of their children, denied them freedom of movement and said that they had to seek permission from their male relatives to leave their house, or pardoning gang rapists when it was politically expedient. But going forward, I think it is important to have a baseline, to draw a red line around principles that are non-negotiable. And that's having women at the table, ensuring that women have the right to education, the right to work, and the right to participate.
And some of those things are ensured in the new constitution of Afghanistan. Are people afraid that that will be rendered null and void if there's not strong leadership in Afghanistan and if the U.S. isn't looking over the government's shoulder?
Well, the Afghan Constitution guarantees equality for women and for men, but in practice, that equality doesn't have sufficient meaning if people who rape women aren't being punished, if there are government officials in power who have a long history of human rights abuses and aren't being held accountable. I mean, if you aren't punishing people who are abusing women, the fact that you have those guarantees on paper. You have a stronger judicial system. You have a functioning Ministry of the Interior with police that will actually investigate and prosecute cases of violence against women. And you make sure you don't bring back into power people who have a long history of abuses against women, but not just against women, against ethnic minorities. I mean, truly horrific abuses. And those people, in any kind of agreement, at least shouldn't be brought back into the government and given authority over civilians of Afghanistan.
But hasn't it proven it almost impossible to even train and form a good police force because of all the issues with, I'm not excusing this, but with literacy issues? And I mean, that's been part of the problem. I mean, the idea was to train a police force and train an Afghan military, and that has been so problematic. So how do you have a functioning judicial system if you can't even do that? I mean, are there enough people in Afghanistan to actually fill those roles, and is there enough education?
Well, there's so much more that needs to be done, but there are some real bright lights of progress that we can point to. There's a new violence against women law. Rape is now a crime in Afghanistan.
Even marital rape, isn't it, or not?
Rape in general,
right.
But when it comes to enforcing those laws, there's a long way to go. But there's been some training of of police and others who need to carry out that law. And there's no question that it's going to take time, but it's a question of having enough space and enough support for women and others who want to make those changes to allow them to do that. I'm thinking of a woman who I met in rural Afghanistan. Who was in charge of the Women's Affairs Office there, who was just going around and telling women about some of the new rights that they had under the Constitution and under the law. And because she had done that, her dog had been killed, her sister had probably been raped by local soldiers, and she had received these so-called night letters, threatening letters, saying that she was going to be killed by a bomb. And you know, what she said to me was, she said that no matter what, she was not going to stop doing that work. She said, "This is my duty, and as long as I have blood in my body, I will continue this work." She said, "I have 3 children and I'm not afraid of anything." She said, "These people are not even going to give us our rights in Islam, so how are they going to give us human rights?" And I think, you know, this is the kind of woman who needs international support so she can bring the most basic kinds of changes to women in Afghanistan.
So is protecting women, you know, I know that Richard Haas was just on Face the Nation, and he was talking about the level of commitment wasn't commensurate with what was going on in Afghanistan in terms of people from al-Qaeda and the Taliban's presence in that country, that our commitment wasn't commensurate with what was really happening on the ground. Is protecting human rights for women and women's rights and keeping them safe, is that enough of a rationale for a continued U.S. presence in Afghanistan?
Well, I think we need to look at the big picture. I mean, first of all, we don't want to trade away women's rights for some so-called peace, because it's wrong to do so. But also, I think we need to look at what would happen. What would happen if a peace deal was cut with abusive, predatory Taliban and other warlords? Would there be peace in Afghanistan? When the Taliban were in power before in Afghanistan, millions of people fled the country. The country was incredibly destabilized. I mean, I think we need to look both.
What do you think would happen if, in fact, I mean, take that one step further, if the Taliban were given positions of authority in the governing body of the country? What else would happen in your view?
Well, let's look at their track record. They shut out school for almost all women and girls, and for a whole lot of boys in Afghanistan. There were fewer than 3% of girls attending school. I think we'd see more cases like the cover of Time magazine, where we'd have violent, summary justice for women who just want to leave an abusive husband. We saw a massive outflow of refugees from the country. They're concerned of what would happen with ethnic minorities. I mean,
what
I
about
don't think
terrorism? Do you think terrorism would come back sort of in a very real way, and that it would become the terrorist training ground that seems to have subsided slightly, and as members of al-Qaeda go to Pakistan and other safe havens?
I think we should be concerned about by looking back at the track record of the Taliban and making sure that that doesn't happen in the future. And that means if they're going to be peace deals that are negotiating, making sure that we don't bring people back into power who have a history of human rights abuses against their own people.
Do you think that protecting women in Afghanistan is a strong enough rationale for a continued U.S. presence? I know you're not an Afghanistan expert, but just from looking at this, I guess this is, of course, the big dilemma for foreign policy. You know, the U.S. didn't go out in full force in Darfur, where women were being raped and murdered as they tried to get water for their families and being, terribly, terribly abused. So, at some point, can the United States, as horrific as these crimes are and the situation is, should we as a foreign policy body put ourselves in the position of policing the world and keeping human rights? Of course, isn't that the big question?
Well, the question is whether, it's necessary but not sufficient. It should be one factor. The Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, Richard Holbrooke have all talked about the commitment that the U.S. has to women in Afghanistan. Secretary Clinton has said, "We'll stand by you forever." Ambassador Holbrooke has made these points over and over to Hamid Karzai. But it isn't the sole reason that we're in Afghanistan. It's not even anywhere near what the mission statement of the president is in terms of why we are in Afghanistan. You had the vice president last week saying that we're not nation building, that it is basically, we're there to make it a place that cannot be a safe haven for al-Qaeda. But I think realistically, and part of the reason we did this story, is that we have been nation building. Whether that's covertly or something that we're advertising, we have made changes in that society. And there are certain things that are unconditional as a baseline of what human rights are for women and for men. And I think that's something that we all want. At the same time, I think it goes without saying, and anybody who's even remotely a foreign policy realist would say that the U.S. can't be a policeman and we can't enforce what are our small d democratic values on every country that we're involved with.
What do you think of it, Zama? I mean,
well, I don't think the question really is, are we going to police the world just for women's rights? It's part of the larger picture of why the U.S. is involved in Afghanistan, why it's been involved in Afghanistan for a long time, and why it's important for the U.S. and the international community in general to remain committed to Afghanistan. An important part of that is what happens to women and girls in the country. But there's no question that men and boys would be in very bad shape if abusive commanders were brought into power again in Afghanistan.
But what about this timeline of July 2011? If you listen to Secretary Gates, he'll say it's not that many troops that are going to be actually extricated from the country, and it will depend on conditions on the ground. And then you have Nancy Pelosi, of course, representing another point of view, saying the American people want to bring most of these troops home. So obviously, I mean, we're going to be up against the wall. We can't be protecting human rights for women and basically be leaving the country. Should there be more of an international effort? I mean, what is the solution? Because obviously all sides cannot be placated here.
Well, we're not military strategists, so I won't comment on the exact number of troops, but I will say that continued involvement of the United States in Afghanistan, both militarily and in a civilian way, is very important, and that there is a very important role for other governments as well. And that means having a commitment to ensuring a government that is going to provide basic protections from women against violence and ensure that women participate in the life of the country.
It's interesting because a lot of progressive people don't want the U.S. in Afghanistan, but a lot of progressive people want women and children and girls to be protected in Afghanistan.
Even non-progressive people might want that, Katie.
Yeah, well, no, that's
I'm
true.
kidding,
No, that's true, actually. That's a good point. But I'm just saying, it seems like that particular group of people might be at odds in terms of kind of answering both masters
I think
there.
that, and part of the reason that I think that our cover has struck a nerve is that that precisely is what has happened to people who feel that they're progressive or liberal and feel like we should not be in Afghanistan are realizing at the same time we're doing something that's progressive and liberal in terms of helping women, and they feel a conflict about it. And that is what makes foreign policy decisions so hard, is because they're competing equities, they're competing values, and they're both important.
But it's also not a binary choice, and I think this is something that the article well illustrates, is that it's not a question of women's rights versus peace. It's about finding some sort of negotiated settlement that includes women's rights and rights for all civilians at its core. And it's certainly, that's certainly something that's possible.
Well, do you think that that can be achieved with Taliban involvement? It certainly doesn't seem that way.
I think what can be achieved is insisting on certain non-negotiable principles, and that have to do with, among other things, basic women's rights, but also making sure that you don't bring back into positions of power people with blood on their hands.
But do you worry that, yes, it'll be all nice and tied with a bow and they'll have these stated principles, and of course women's rights will be a part of that, but as you said earlier, Zama, when it comes to enforcing, when it comes to protecting, that's a whole different ball of wax.
And the teeth behind it are really important. I mean, unless you're actually holding people accountable for war crimes, for other serious violations against civilians, you don't have those same kinds of teeth. And that's why Human Rights Watch has called for the prosecution of people who are guilty of serious war crimes and for the repeal of an amnesty law that has just passed in Afghanistan that would basically provide impunity for people who are guilty of such serious crimes.
Are you hopeful that those things will actually come to pass, though?
We are pressing for those things to come into pass. I mean, I don't think you can bring people who are used to doing things in the same old, dirty way back into power and expect them to behave differently unless they're people who are actually being punished for those kinds of crimes.
A Twitter question from Eastside Ramble says, I wonder how receptive most Afghani women have been to those trying to help them. Can change be as scary as continued abuse? That's something we touched on earlier. But when you talk to women in the country, what do they say? What do they want? What are they afraid of? I mean, it must run the gamut because there's so many different women who feel so differently about the subject, right?
I've talked to a lot of women and girls in Afghanistan, and one of the themes throughout those conversations is the desire to not live with violence and the desire to participate in the decisions that affect them, to participate and to help decide for themselves how to express their religion, to decide to go to school or to work outside the home, to be part of the decisions that are being made about them and about their children. I mean,
but isn't there a sizable part of the population also, Zama, who, and I know you had a compelling photo of women in their burqas, who would rather go along to get along and are not as courageous as some of the women you're describing now?
Well, there's that famous quote of, I wear three burqas if I could just get a job. And I mean, I've documented the forced imposition of burqas on women among either human rights abuses, but women will tell you, I mean, they are really focused, most women I've talked to are really focused on the most important things, and if wearing a burqa will help them get to their job or to their school, that some women or many women are willing to make that compromise. So I think we have to keep our eye on the most important thing. But
so they may be wearing a burqa, but underneath they're very different in terms of their attitude. They see it as a means to an end. Really,
it varies, and
right.
Some women say to me, that they want nothing more than to have the right to take off their burqa. But many women I've talked to say, let's keep focused on what's important. Can I send my children to school? Can I go to the hospital at night when I'm giving birth without being killed on the road, or am I going to die at home? I mean, the situation in terms of access to education and healthcare is still very dire for many women in Afghanistan. I mean, I talked to a woman doctor in Western Afghanistan, for example, who said, she didn't really care about the burqa, but she needed to drive herself to the hospital, and who can drive in a burqa? And she was actually doing a lot of medical care for people at home. So I mean, I think there's a range of things of what women want in Afghanistan. But I have to tell you, women's hopes were so high when I was there, for example, in 2002, about what they might expect now that the Taliban were gone. And now those women just need support to continue to work to try to make some of the changes that have to do with the fundamentals of their lives.
And do they feel like they need a presence of U.S. troops in order to move forward, or can they envision any other way of accomplishing their goals without the military there en masse?
Well, many women have told us that they support some sort of negotiated peace agreement, but what those women have also said, and in fact, a group of women just put out a strong statement about 10 days ago, women leaders in Kabul, that said, for any kind of peace and security commissions, we want at least 30% of women involved in those commissions. We want a seat at the table so that we aren't traded away in some sort of backdoor expedient deal for a so-called peace.
Do you think that's going to happen, that women's rights will be shelved? I mean, I know that Hamid Karzai, there was a pretty chilling quote in the article, Rick, basically saying that what's more important, protecting the right of a girl to go to school or saving her life? I mean, will it ultimately come down to that, do you think, in terms of what is in store for the future of Afghanistan?
Yeah, I mean, as you were saying, he's negotiated away women's rights before. It's not the thing that's most paramount for him. I mean, you have to also understand that he's trying to think about stabilizing his country. I mean, even if you look at the word that the American military is using now, we're not talking about counterinsurgency strategy, we're talking about stabilization. What a stabilized Afghanistan means for women as opposed to a successful counterinsurgency strategy are probably two pretty different things.
I know that Afghanistan is often described as the graveyard of empires. I mean, do you think sometimes you feel like the problem is so massive, it's so deeply ingrained, culturally so challenging? Is it really possible to change things for women and to give girls and women in this country any kind of chance to be part and parcel of a civilized society? Because to me, it seems so difficult.
I think it's absolutely certain. I mean, Afghanistan is a place where, in living memory, people can remember things being different. I mean, I've had women pull up pictures of themselves from the 60s and 70s to try to demonstrate that their mother was a teacher, that they were a university student in Kabul. I mean, things were different, at least in certain parts of Afghanistan, not that long ago. I mean, before the Taliban were in power, about 50% of civil servants and about 70% of all teachers were women. I mean, things were different in Afghanistan. Not everywhere and not for all women, but in certain parts of the country. And so it's certainly plausible for it to be that way again.
What do you think is ahead for Afghanistan? Again, knowing that this isn't something you cover day in and day out, Rick, but when you think about what can the U.S. do? How can they reduce? How can this country reduce its commitment militarily and yet try to stabilize this country without nation building and without a huge presence of military troops?
I mean, look, throughout our history, anytime we make a military commitment, it has to be supported by the public. And the longer the commitment, the more enduring the support of the public is. And so I think the Obama government has to think about how do we actually get support for this long-term commitment in Afghanistan. There are a lot of...
How is the government really trying to do that when they're talking about a timeline for drawing down?
No, they're not. I mean, and they're having difficulty making the argument about why it's in our national interest to be there. People are skeptical. People are tired. There's been $300 billion spent there during the last 9 years, and people feel like, well, the Taliban is more powerful now than it was in 2002. So, as you were saying before, people are a little bit tired of the commitment. So if the administration wants to be able to protect some of these women's rights, they want to be able to remain there in a way that they can be effective in terms of having some control over civil society, then they have to make that argument to the American people, and the American people have to buy into it.
Another Twitter question: would Afghan women benefit if NATO pulled out and we spent half the money on a humanitarian-only Red Crescent mission? In other words, are we putting money in the wrong place, or what do you think of that question? I thought that was interesting.
Well, this actually, goes to some people's interpretation of Nick Kristof's piece in the New York Times not so long ago, and that is, are we investing in the right places? And frankly,
should we be investing in 20 schools instead of a single soldier, right?
Right. And I think the real question is, are we investing in all the pieces that are so important? If an area is completely insecure, it's too dangerous for women and girls to go to school. And that's what they've told me when I've gone to schools that have been attacked and burned down and blown up. At the same time, building an education system or creating space for the Afghan government to provide education to its people is at the core of establishing a stable Afghanistan. So the
not just for girls, by the way.
Oh, absolutely, for boys as well. I mean, there's no question that boys' education suffered horribly under the Taliban, and that men and women suffered horribly under the Taliban. So while the rights of women are some of the worst examples of the abuses by the Taliban, they are not by far the only examples. And really, to come back to your question, making sure that we have a government that's stable enough just to fulfill the most basic functions of government is the other piece of the story, along with providing security.
Well, I think this was a very brave cover, Rick, and I'm glad you did it. And I think these are the kind of conversations that should be going on as this very critical issue is debated and debated at a pretty breakneck speed in terms of the potential withdrawal of U.S. troops next summer. And I'm glad you did it. Are you glad you did it?
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, we wanted to contribute to the debate and the conversation, and this is obviously a really important aspect of it.
And certainly timely with all the documents that were leaked on WikiLeaks, and of course that kind of, I think, really sort of put a spotlight on the debate. So
absolutely.
It was very timely as a result, too.
We're a weekly news magazine.
I know. See, you still have a role in society, in my opinion. Anyway, Rick Stengel and Zama Coursen-Neff, Deputy Director of the Children's Rights Division at Human Rights Watch. How often have you gone to Afghanistan, Zama?
I've been numerous times since 2002, and it's an issue that Human Rights Watch has vigorously pursued and documented, even during the communist period.
Do you ever worry about your own personal safety when you go there?
What I think about is the safety of the women and girls who risk their lives in order to try to tell the world about what's happening in Afghanistan. But far too often in corners of Afghanistan, we just don't know what's happening. And so that's why it's so important that, while very difficult to look at, we have this photograph that gives an illustration of Taliban-style justice, and something that I think we really need to recognize why the commitment of the international community is so important, both to the women and girls of Afghanistan and for the stability of the country in the long term.
And real quickly, how can the international community be more committed so it's not just the United States? Is there a way for everyone to be involved in this in a manner that they haven't heretofore?
Absolutely, and many other nations have also played a very important role in Afghanistan. It's very important that the world stays present and tells the Afghan people that we will not forget about you and that we won't betray you.
All right. Well, Zama and Rick, thanks again. Nice to talk to both of you. And thank you for watching and for tweeting your questions to us. By the way, you can follow me on Twitter. My handle is @KatieCouric. To read the reports Human Rights Watch has published about women in Afghanistan, you can go to hrw.org. And now stay tuned for a message from our sponsor, Dove.